George III is remembered in history today as a king who was plagued by many problems regarding his mental health. He was a man who continued to relapse throughout the decades. However, in 1810, his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, became known as the Prince Regent. George III had been incapacitated and was considered unfit to rule, and his son then was calling the shots across England. But George III was the longest lived and longest reigning British monarch at the time, but his son would succeed him, becoming known as George IV. But George IV in his final years was himself plagued by poor health, and he put weight on at the same speed as Henry VIII did, and he was also a very heavy drinker. But as time caught up with him, his body would struggle, and he was described by one observer as wasting away frightfully day after day, and he was also described as being so obese that he looked like a great sausage stuffed into a covering. But what is the story of the painful death of King George IV? Join us today as we find out, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. George IV was the eldest son of George III, and it was said that when he was at the age of 17, he had become too fond of women and wine, but his father was not the fondest of his heir. The prince in 1784 met Maria Fitzherbert and married her secretly on the 15th of December 1785. However, this marriage was then declared invalid, as members of the royal family, under the age of 25, were forbidden to marry without the consent of their king. But in order to get Parliament to pay his debts, the prince entered a loveless marriage with his cousin Caroline. But a few weeks after the birth of their only child, the couple separated, and Caroline went on to live in Italy. But as mentioned, in November 1810, George III became unfit to rule. Then afterwards the prince became the regent under the Regency Act 1811. George kept many of his father's ministers, and this benefited England as others were prepared to leave the war with France and to allow Napoleon to become the master of Europe. But Britain would triumph over Napoleon in 1815, but when George IV became king, Caroline returned to claim her right as a queen consort. A bill to deprive her of these rights was introduced to the House of Lords, but was never voted on by the Commons. George IV's coronation occurred on the 19th of July 1821, and it was huge and lavish. His crown contained 12,000 diamonds, and 2,000 people attended the coronation banquet. Caroline also showed up, asking to be crowned, but she was refused entry. He was not enamoured by his prime ministers, and George was considered an intellectual and also a key fan of the arts. He commissioned the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which was designed like a Mughal palace, and he also restored much of Windsor Castle. But George had ruled as regent from 1811, and then was just king for around 10 years until he died in 1830. His reputation across the country was mixed. As one writer wrote of his death, there never was an individual less regretted by his fellow low creatures than this deceased king, but those who knew him liked him. But throughout his life, George had been known for loving food and wine, and he had huge banquets. But this led to him becoming rather large, and he then developed gout. Paintings made of him were much more flattering than what was reality, and Queen Victoria would later say of her uncle that his face was covered with grease. However, his last years were characterised by poor health, including conditions such as rheumatism, dropsy, and the hardening of his arteries. He may have also been suffering from the onset of dementia, but George lived his final years inside the privacy of Windsor Castle, and he was known to have spent days on end in bed, and he also suffered from breathlessness, which left him half asphyxiated. By 1827, George was being carried around up and down the stairs, and was wheeled around in a wheelchair, and he became even more reclusive. There were great efforts made to stop people seeing the king in this state, being carried to his carriage, and he spent the last few years of his life at Windsor. George, it's believed, also became blind in one eye, and he took medication for his bladder pain, and he spent a lot of his time drugged up. He then, by spring of 1830, became very unwell. One witness referred to him as blind as a beetle, and he was forced to stamp legislation with his signature, and he did not know what he was signing for. His weight at this time was around 20 stone, and the attacks of breathlessness continued, and he was forced to sleep upright in a chair, and the doctor had to drain fluid from his abdomen. But the king did still want to live, and he had a huge appetite. For breakfast it was said he had a pigeon and beef steak pie, 3 parts of a bottle of Moselle, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port and a glass of brandy, followed by medication and sedatives. It was also said that His Majesty's constitution is a gigantic one, and his elasticity under the most severe pressure exceeds what I have ever witnessed. George then dictated his will, and in his final months he became very devoted and devoted to his faith, and confessed that he regretted his miserable life, but wanted mercy and death to be shown upon him. He was at this point unable to lie down, and then he caught a cough which caused further problems, but then he said in private that things are coming to a conclusion. I shall be released about Monday. On the evening of the 25th of June 1830, the king was seriously ill, and he was asleep in a specially fitted chair, and he leaned onto the table in front of him and rested his forehead on one hand. His physician and doctor had been sent away for the evening, and his close friend, Sir Jonathan Wathen Waller, sat with him holding his hand, as the king wanted constant reassurance. At 1:45 a.m. he awoke and asked for medicine before he fell asleep, and then at 3 a.m. he woke again asking for his night chair. The king felt very faint and asked for the windows to be opened, and then the doctor was summoned. The king exclaimed, "My dear boy, this is death." George closed his eyes and lay back then in his chair. He had passed a very bad bowel movement tinted with blood, and this caused great worry with the doctors. But then at 3:15 a.m, George IV died. An autopsy of King George IV showed that he had died from upper gastrointestinal bleeding, following the rupture of a blood vessel in his stomach, and there was also a large tumour the size of an orange found on his bladder. Also his heart was enlarged, and his valves had hardened and become blocked. He was then buried in St George's Chapel, inside of Windsor Castle, the home he greatly loved. George IV was then succeeded by his brother, William IV. But George IV was a king who drank and ate to excess a huge amount, and he put on a lot of weight throughout his life. Many of his portraits show him standing proudly looking slender, but this was not the case, and he was a king who stepped in a number of times to help his father rule, who was not capable. But George suffered throughout his life with his own problems regarding his health, and at the end of his life, he spent the last of his days living reclusely inside Windsor Castle. He is laid to rest today in the royal vaults with many other monarchs, including the recently deceased Elizabeth II. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.